I wonder if it's because of this. Okay.
Okay, so then.
Okay, so I'm sure we'll have a couple other people joining us. Welcome to those of you who are here now. What an interesting day today is, but we are really excited to be having this lunch and learn with Eastside Legal Assistance Program. They are an incredibly important community resource for people who face legal struggles but can't afford a lawyer or don't know how to navigate the system. So we are very excited to have Shane Woerner, is that correct, Shane, your last name? Hopefully I'm saying that right. He's a staff attorney who's responsible for ELAP's Kirkland-focused housing sustainability program. He provides advice and representation to residents of Kirkland who are facing a legal issue that threatens their housing stability, primarily in the area of landlord-tenant laws. Shane obtained his JD from the University of Washington School of Law and began his career as a frequent volunteer attorney at the Housing Justice Project. And it was there where he developed his passion for housing issues and defending the rights of tenants. He joined ELAP in the fall of 2019. And we also have Chris Lovings with a mix of African-American and French heritage. He has spent his time throughout the U.S. as a military child living in 6 different states before he turned 14. Previously, he had done work in the Public Defender's Office in Georgia and worked for a UK-based volunteer organization that sent him to Nepal and Sri Lanka. And since 2017, works as a community engagement manager at ELAP, making sure that everyone has equal access to justice. So just so everybody knows, we are Facebook live streaming this right now, and we are recording it as well. So we'll have it as a resource that we can send to other people who couldn't make it today. But guys, I think we're ready for you. We're so excited to have you. Thank you for joining us. And you can take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Samantha. Thanks for allowing us to be here. Thank you for the great introduction as well. My name is Chris Loving, as Samantha said. I work as the community engagement manager inside the Ordinances program, in short, it's an ELAP. We're going to talk a little bit today about our services, the work that we do, how we can help some of the people that you may be seeing, and also a little bit about what's changed for us during COVID. And then Shane has programming the team who is the housing attorney, and he's also going to talk a bit about what he's seeing the housing crisis as things stand right now. So to pop into it, I'm just going to start off by saying this is Celeste.
Hey, Chris, I think we can't hear you. I don't think we've been able to hear you.
Let's try it again. Can everyone hear me now?
There we go.
Perfect. Great. Thanks so much.
Great.
Good. Thanks, Samantha. All right, let's go ahead. Let's go back. Let's start all over again. No worries. My name is Chris Lovings. Thank you, Samantha, and the Chamber of Commerce for having Shane and myself here. As she mentioned, I am the Community Engagement Manager for Eastside Legal Assistance Program. She mentioned ELAP. We're also known as ELAP. Kind of rolls off the tongue a little bit easier. In the work that we do, and as we're talking today, I'm going to get into the work that we do and what that looks like for us. Is going to be serving people who don't have an attorney in civil legal aid. And so today's presentation is going to be about our services, what we're able to offer, and then we're also going to jump to Shane, who's going to talk about his work as a housing attorney, what he's seeing, and COVID updates from our end of things. Thank you for mentioning you couldn't hear me. That would have been bad. So starting off our story, we're going to talk today about Celeste for a little bit. Her name hasn't changed. Celeste is a mom who a couple of years ago was involved in a domestic violence dispute with a partner, and she needed an attorney. She wanted to get safe and wanted to get away from the harming effects that this abuse was having on her life and life of her child. The issue with Celeste is that she didn't have any money. And a lot of times in our legal system, if you don't have money, it can be really hard to get the justice that you need. This is why ELAP exists. We believe that everyone deserves access to legal help. We're a nonprofit 501c3 that's focused on working with people with domestic violence situations, housing situations, financial, healthcare, immigration, other issues that need a legal solution. Our job is to make sure that people have access to services that we provide, trying to go forward, and kind of talking about who we serve, people who can't afford an attorney, tenants, domestic violence survivors, immigrants, documented or undocumented, veterans, as well as patients at community medical facilities. We are a team of 18, including 6 staff attorneys, and with the support of our staff, as well as volunteer attorneys, we provide hundreds of hours of free civil legal help to people that live throughout King County every single year. That's one thing I do want to mention as far as the boundaries of what ELAP is able to provide. We serve anyone that lives in King County as long as they are low income or their case has to have originated in King County. And so as an example, if you're someone who's a domestic violence survivor and you can't stay in county, but your case has started in King County, we're able to serve you as well. And so we've had clients that have moved out of county, out of state, one out of the country actually, to escape from the abuse, and we're able to serve them as well. So what do we actually do? This is a list of bullet points about what we do, but like I mentioned before, our goal is to make sure that people that don't have access to civil legal aid have access to it. In other words, I think I want to distinguish between civil legal aid and criminal legal aid. So if you are someone who has been involved with the police for a crime, that falls under criminal law. ELAP actually serves civil law. So generally the cases that we work with don't involve the police. There are some cases where it does with domestic violence survivors, but generally you're going to see things that happen in small claims courts and things like that. That's where ELAP actually serves. To kind of talk a little bit about our programs, the main program that we are, I should say, where we see a majority of our clients comes through our legal advice clinics. These clinics are where clients receive one-on-one personalized legal advice, we call it advice and counsel clinics, to where they receive information on their civil legal need. And so if you are someone who is dealing with an immigration concern, for example, you want to bring over someone from your home country to the US and you want to know how you can get them a green card. If you have a situation where you need to file for a divorce and you want to know what the steps are for that. If you're someone who's dealing with creditors that are calling you consistently to harass you, or something like tenant law issues, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security questions and things like that, those are where our legal advice clinics come from. Or that's where you can receive help, is actually at our legal advice clinics. I want to mention one point about the legal advice clinics. While our attorneys in those clinics don't offer representation, they do give you advice and counsel. And so if you have questions that need to be answered, if you have forms that you need help filling out, that's the kind of the way that you can access those services. You can have as many clinic appointments as you need, provided you still do qualify. And there's an income-based qualification level. And so if you are someone who is at 200% or below the federal poverty guidelines, and you live in King County, you will be able to qualify for our legal clinics. For someone that is a household of 2, that is roughly $2,500 per month or less. That will be 200% of the federal poverty guidelines. If you make below that, you will qualify for our legal clinics. Another piece of work that we do is our wills clinic. And I want to mention this specifically because we actually have an upcoming virtual wills clinic. So pre-COVID, we would meet in a community gathering space, be it a library, a community center, a place of worship, a school, and have what we called our wills clinic. This is where attorneys, volunteer attorneys would come, and we would serve people who needed a will, a power of attorney, or an advanced medical directive, which can also be called a living will. We would have notaries that were on hand that could help you to fill out these documents. It was a completely free service, and you left with a completed packet. Sadly, due to COVID, we can't do that right now. And so we actually are having a virtual wills clinic at this point. What that's going to look like is you're going to be over Zoom, or we can actually call you, and you can have these documents filled out free of charge with an attorney that can over video chat or over Zoom, like I mentioned. And yeah, so that is going to be this Thursday evening. I will post a flyer as well and send it to you, Samantha, as well, so you can kind of distribute it to anyone that signed up and wasn't able to make it here. We are on the lookout for clients for this, so would love to see anyone that's interested there. We also do Neurorights info sessions. This is an extension kind of the presentation I'm giving right now, but it's where a specific legal topic that is pertinent for the community we'll have an attorney or another organization or ELAP ourselves will come and present information. We have done previous ones. Shane's done one on housing and tenant law currently. We've done one on the public charge rule that has dominated the conversation around immigration recently. Basically, anything that a community wants to know, we're willing to do a kind of a community info session. I should note that the info sessions are, anyone can attend those. You don't have to qualify or anything. We just send out information about it. And if you'd like to be added to the mailing list for that, please let me know. I'm going to talk about 3 other programs. We have what's called a medical legal partnership. This is in conjunction with a community health clinics, actually 2 community health clinics, International Community Health Services in Shoreline and Bellevue, and then another community health clinic, Health Point in Redmond. And this is where we have an attorney that goes there, and she is working with the medical staff there to identify health harming social conditions that the medical staff are seeing that may have a legal solution. As an example, there was a story of a couple of years back when we started this program where someone had a child who had lung issues and was consistently going to the health clinic because of the lung issues. Come to find out, the reason for those lung issues was because there was black mold in the apartment. And so the attorney was able to work with that patient and get that situation resolved to where their child wasn't harmed anymore. It's a win-win for the medical facility as well as for the patient that they're seeing. Another program that we have is our domestic violence legal program. This is where we have 4 full-time staff attorneys who do work to provide support and legal help for domestic violence survivors and their children. We work closely with community partner domestic violence agencies like Lifeline on the East Side, the Domestic Abuse Women's Network down in Kent, and New Beginnings in Seattle. And the whole goal of this program is to provide those domestic violence survivors with safety measures. So it could be helping out with a safety plan. It could be filing for a temporary protection order. It could be helping out with a parenting plan to make sure they get their child and keep their child during the situations. And then finally, the last program is our Project Safety. This is where we provide critical and time-sensitive legal assistance to survivors of crime, where we have a navigator that works with the court system, works with the advocacy office, works with other legal aid organizations to navigate the victim of a crime through the legal aid system to provide them as much support as they need. They could also refer them out to the Neurorights Immigrant Rights Project. If the client has a situation with immigration, they can pass them along to ELAP in our domestic violence program. If the person needs help with domestic violence, they basically navigate the legal system for those that need help. As we're going through as well, I should have noticed, I apologize. If you have any questions, you can feel free to type them into the chat and we'll get them at the very end of our Q&A session. Should have mentioned at the beginning, apologies. And so what's going on with ELAP during COVID? So previously we had our services that were generally in person. If people were unable to get to a community center to see a presentation or get to the Kirkland Senior Center to actually meet with an attorney one-on-one, they could call over the phone. Due to COVID, we actually have closed down those programs. I should rephrase that. Due to COVID, we moved those programs to telephonic services. And so all the services that I mentioned above are still available. They're just happening over the telephone or in a Zoom platform. And so all of our legal clinics are telephonic. Our webinars that were previously Know Your Rights sessions are now happening over Zoom. As I mentioned, these are presentations where we talk about different legal topics that are topical and that the community requests. And then another piece of work that we have been doing is around the realm of advocacy work. Shane's going to go into a bit of information about tenant protections in a bit, but I wanted to make the point about the need for people to stay housed. You know, when you're talking about tenants, a lot of people have heard about the upcoming housing crisis. Many people know there's a moratorium in place, but I want to highlight the point about the need for tenant protections when you're talking about safety and making people stay housed. And I'll let Shane talk a little bit more about that, but just wanted to mention that point. Speaking of which, I'm going to pass it over to Shane Woerner, who is a housing stability program attorney, and he'll be talking about his program as well as what he's seeing in the housing realm.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So yeah, my name is Shane Woerner. I am one of our housing stability program attorneys. I'm actually our staff attorney for our housing program that specifically focuses on the city of Kirkland and assisting low-income residents of Kirkland who are facing civil legal issues that threaten their housing or the stability of their housing situation. This is really kind of an area that ELAP has been able to start working more specifically on, thanks to the city of Kirkland, because my program is actually a pilot program designed to see what we can do when given an opportunity to address these unmet legal needs, kind of as Chris was describing. So the services that I can offer, and we also have another staff attorney on this program who assists tenants who are throughout King County with a special emphasis on South King County, and also on assisting veterans, seniors, and vulnerable populations. We can assist with anything from giving tenants just a short consult where we might provide them with advice on their legal rights in their situation. We can also assist with negotiating with landlords. And if and when it comes to a situation where an eviction lawsuit has been filed, we can help with eviction defense as well. Although, King County also benefits from a really great eviction defense clinic and the Housing Justice Project that is housed in both the Seattle and Kent courthouses. So as you can see on the screen here, we have a couple of ways that tenants can reach us if they need help with their housing situation, with a legal matter related to their housing. We've got an online intake form that we have shortened the link to something a bit more manageable, as you can see there. And we also have our main phone lines that are available. We have an English line and a Spanish line with both of those numbers on the screen there. So I kind of want to move on to just a brief overview of sort of what governments have done to address the COVID-19 pandemic and the instability that has caused for a lot of tenants and homeowners throughout the country, of course. And so since my experience tends to be on that tenant side, I just want to real quick go over at the federal level, which is sort of the baseline level of, I guess, protection setting. You've got what the federal level can set, and then states can come in and sort of expand on those protections above and beyond that if they so choose. So you may have heard back in early September, the CDC issued an order that prohibits certain residential evictions. And that moratorium applies in any state or jurisdiction that does not have an eviction moratorium in place that provides an equal or a greater level of public health protection. So in order to be eligible for those protections, the tenant needs to be able to sign on to a declaration attesting to several facts about their housing situation that makes them qualified. So just a couple examples are the tenant's income has to be below a certain threshold for the year. So we anticipate not receiving income above, I believe it's $99,000 for a single filer. Or they have to have been eligible for a stimulus check, or they have to have been, their income for 2019 has to have been low enough to where they were not required to file a tax return. A couple other requirements that they have to attest to is that they have sought any and all available government rental assistance, that they have been making timely partial payments to the best of their ability, after factoring in other necessary expenses. So sort of things like that. I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but that's just an example of, in order to be protected by the CDC's moratorium, the tenant needs to be able to sign a declaration attesting to these things, and then they need to give that to the landlord. And then at that point, they are protected from certain evictions. Specifically, non-payment is a big focus of the CDC moratorium. But then the exceptions really are for other lease violations, where evictions can still move forward, even if even if the tenant, he might be protected on the non-payment front if they're violating other provisions of the lease. The CDC moratorium does allow eviction to proceed in that case. I also want to note briefly that the CDC released some updated guidance that has really loosened the strength of those protections to where I think my understanding is, for the most part, the actual eviction process can move forward. It's just that the physical eviction itself can't be carried out where a tenant is protected. So it's one of those situations where at the federal level, it's more than nothing, but it has been loosened pretty considerably by that updated guidance. And then getting down to the state level in Washington, as you all probably know, we have a statewide eviction moratorium that has several prohibitions on landlords in concern to the things that they are and are not allowed to do with a tenant who might not be paying rent. So just obviously the big one is the landlord cannot issue an eviction notice or threaten to issue an eviction notice unless one of several exceptions is met. So those three exceptions are: the tenant is posing a significant and immediate threat to the health, safety, or property of another. The second being that the landlord provided the tenant with written 60 days notice of their intent to occupy the property as their primary residence. And the final exception is that the landlord provided the tenant with 60-day written notice of their intent to sell the property. So if none of those apply, the landlord is prohibited from issuing or threatening to issue an eviction notice, and prohibited from actually going into court and seeking a judicial eviction order. And then some other prohibitions: landlords are prohibited from increasing rent. There's also a part of that provision in the moratorium that does apply to certain commercial leases in specific circumstances. As I think we probably made clear, I don't do any work on the commercial side, but I think that is something that's important to be aware of, that if you go in and look at its governor's proclamation 20-19.4, there is a provision regarding a ban on rent increases, and it does address commercial leases in certain circumstances. I believe it's pretty limited, but it's still worth being aware of. And then getting back to residential leases, landlords are prohibited from assessing late fees. They are prohibited from charging rent for any periods of time that tenants couldn't occupy the housing due to COVID-19. So if you've got a situation where, a student was set to lease an apartment, but then they had to move back home because of COVID-19, like if the school got shut down, that landlord is prohibited from collecting rent for that period that the student was prohibited from occupying the rental housing. So that's not an exhaustive list. Those are just some of the protections that are currently in place. And that moratorium is set currently to expire at the end of this year. So December 31st at midnight, basically. It has been extended several times since it was initially issued. So we won't know until later next month, probably, whether we'll get another extension. Although I will just note that these protections are subject to change. The governor could technically step in at any point in time and alter it as he sees fit. So that's just something to be aware of. And then I also want to touch on city protections and sort of some of the things that I have seen as this pandemic has gone on, and as the governor has kind of adjusted the statewide moratorium, and sort of the importance of city level protections in light of that. So I touched on briefly those two 60-day notice exceptions, and that has been a big portion of what my work has been the last few months. I believe that was initially implemented sometime during the summer, like around June or July. And that primarily seems to be, based on what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing, that seems to be the bulk of evictions that are moving forward under the moratorium, is a tenant has been issued a 60-day notice that the landlord either intends to sell the property or that the landlord intends to move into the property. And when you look at the way that that has been set up in the moratorium, it's really just that the landlord needs to state their intent to do one of those two things. The landlord doesn't actually need to prove to any extent that they followed up on it, or that they actually took any action towards moving in or selling the property. There has been a change in the most recent update to the moratorium where now that notice needs to come in the form of an affidavit signed under the penalty of perjury. But I guess where I kind of view a shortcoming of that exception is that obviously plans change, intentions change. So I think that it's still, it's something that can still, for my taste, too easily be used as sort of a pretext to otherwise be able to evict a tenant who might not have been paying rent. So I think that's sort of where the importance of city protections comes into play, because cities can, and I think should, implement stronger protections to, as Chris touched on earlier, make sure that people are staying housed, especially as we get into winter. We're already seeing rates of COVID-19 spiking again. Things could get pretty bad during the winter, especially depending on what actions are or aren't taken. So I think that we're going to see an even greater importance on keeping people housed, and that is something that cities can step in and take action on. And we've seen some cities do that in King County already, just specifically related to COVID-19. We have seen the city of Seattle has its own moratorium under which a landlord, at least my understanding is that the landlord can't actually issue such a 60-day notice. It's just that sort of notice is not allowed under the city of Seattle's moratorium. But I also wanted to talk about as well, kind of just general tenant protections. Just cause ordinances are a really important one. And we've seen cities more frequently are passing legislation to require just cause in order to terminate a tenancy. And sort of what that means is in most of Washington, in most cities of Washington state, if you're a month-to-month tenant, your landlord can terminate your tenancy for whatever reason, as long as they provide you with 20 days written notice. There doesn't have to be a lease violation. The landlord doesn't have to allege a lease violation. They can just terminate your tenancy as long as they give you written 20-day notice. And what a just cause ordinance requires is that the landlord must have some good cause for terminating that lease. So they would have to allege some sort of lease violation in order to terminate the lease. And that is a really important protection for tenants because, as I said, especially right now, going into winter in the middle of COVID-19, 20 days is not enough time really for anyone to be able to find new housing, let alone someone who is financially burdened already when it comes to paying their rent. So that is something that I think all cities can do. We've seen Auburn most recently, I believe, passed a just cause ordinance. There's also just cause ordinances in Federal Way and Burien. Seattle has had one for quite some time. I believe those are the 4 cities in the state of Washington that have these ordinances. But this is something that really any city can and should be looking at because I think we need to keep in mind the urgency of this situation. And what I mean by that is we have these protections in place, right? There are prohibitions on, you could say, most evictions right now outside of those exceptions. So that's all well and good, right? But if you think about where we are at, nothing that I've described negates a tenant's obligation to pay rent, right? The tenants still are obligated to pay rent, so those rent debts are piling up. And eventually, at some point, one would think these protections are going to end. And we're already seeing massive amounts of unpaid rent throughout Washington state. So once those eviction prohibitions are no longer in place, it's hard not to conclude that there's going to be an enormous influx of eviction lawsuits and families getting evicted from their homes once those protections are no longer in effect. So I think that it's very important for cities to be looking ahead now to what they can do in advance to protect people as much as possible from that. I don't want to say inevitable, but sometimes it feels almost inevitable wave of eviction lawsuits that we're kind of looking at as we get, people get further and further into rent debt. So those are a couple of things, a citywide moratorium or a just cause ordinance that cities can look at. There have also been other jurisdictions that have tried to come up with some creative ways to protect people from eviction. That is where the unpaid rent is related to COVID-19. So I believe down in Oregon, and I believe the city of San Francisco, they passed laws or ordinances that create a defense to eviction for unpaid rent that accrued during the pandemic or the emergency of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that sort of extends into the future. So that rent, that rent isn't canceled, it's still due, but the tenant can't be evicted for that specific unpaid rent. So that's sort of another creative solution that cities can start looking at. And I think I just wanted to also touch on, when we're talking about the urgency of this situation, I think it's important to keep in mind as well that eviction is and always has been something that disproportionately hits families broken down along racial lines. In Washington state, even before COVID-19, we were seeing this sort of, we were seeing a disproportionate impact on families of color when it comes to eviction cases. And then COVID-19 happened, and you look at the data being collected by the Census Bureau in their pulse surveys. The most recent data that I was able to find was for late September 16th to October 2nd or 3rd, I believe. And when you look at the responses coming in, about 1 in 5 families, 1 in 5 white families responding, felt that they were somewhat or very likely to be evicted in the next 2 months. 1 in 5 is a shocking enough number as it is, but then when you look at Black respondents to the same survey, it jumps up to almost 1 in 2 respondents felt that they were likely to, somewhat or very likely to be evicted in the next 2 months. I believe it's something like 48%. So I think that all that sort of comes together to really emphasize how urgent this issue is and how important it is that we're looking at solutions now. And I think especially, if you sort of agree with us how urgent and important an issue this is to make sure that we're keeping people housed and protecting our community from a wave of evictions, I think that as members of the Chamber of Commerce, I think you have a really important and influential role in our local community. And I think that if you agree that these are really urgent matters that the city should address, I really do think it would make a difference that the city council is hearing from people about, hey, I'm worried about what will happen to our community if suddenly January rolls around and there's no more protections and we see a wave of evictions. So I guess you could consider it a bit of a call to action there. If you agree that this is something that's important that cities should be thinking about, I think it makes a huge difference that elected officials are hearing from people, especially right now. So I know that was a lot of information pretty quickly. I think next we wanted to just touch on some information that is specific to small businesses, and especially I know with Communities Rise, I believe they have a heavy emphasis on small nonprofits as well. Chris, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, and I'll briefly say, when we were asked to do this presentation, one of the questions that had come up was about the idea around commercial leases. And as Shane mentioned, we don't cover commercial leases. We work for individuals, not necessarily organizations, or we work with organizations, but we work for clients. And so I'm going to put a link in the chat. This is from a presentation that was done by Perkins Coie attorneys, as well as in conjunction with Communities Rise. For those that don't know, Communities Rise, their whole goal was to provide legal advice to nonprofits and small businesses, throughout King County. I believe they're only King County based. They do a lot of really great, wonderful work in helping people to figure out if you're starting a nonprofit, what does it look like to start a nonprofit? What are some of the legal things you need to be aware of? As a business, what should you do when you're bringing employees back during COVID? What are the protections that you need to have in place? And so they do a really good job of presenting information. They did a presentation along with Perkins Coie about how to lease negotiate, and also guidance for tenants, during this time. And so that's what we have the information up there. Another question that we do get asked a lot has to do with what about, landlords? What are the resources that they have? The Washington Home Ownership Resource Center has a great website that has a lot of information about what homeowners can do. And then there is also, there's also another organization I can put into the chat that just came to my mind. They offer assistance with foreclosures and advice in that realm that I'll put into the chat in a moment. One of the things I do want to mention is another question that my development director will be really happy that we address is, how can you as someone support the work that ELAP is doing? And so, of course, there is the donate button. At our website, elap.org, we have a donate page. It kind of gives a breakdown of what your donation does and what support that it offers to the low-income clients that we serve. In addition, if you are an attorney, we need volunteers like you. We have events like our Wills Clinic, that if you are a contract attorney, that is the perfect thing for you. If you're someone that can offer legal advice for debt collection and bankruptcy, what that looks like. If you're someone who is a family law attorney or are connected with family law attorneys, we always need volunteer attorneys. I want to give a special shout out. Bruce Gardner, who is on the call, is one of our volunteer attorneys. He works in our he actually volunteers his time in our general law clinic, serving clients consistently. He's been a volunteer for quite a while. And I don't know if you want to mention and say anything, Bruce, but I did want to mention that you are on the call, and we thank you for the assistance that you're able to help us and our clients that we work with. And he may have stepped away.
Yeah, I just needed to turn on my mic.
Go ahead.
See if it was turned on. No, I'm very happy to work in the clinic. I've done it for quite a few years. We only see people for about a half an hour. Used to see people, now we only talk to them on the phone. But it's a very, very useful service. Much of the time, it's not simply giving legal advice. It's simply providing an ear to hear them and hear what their problem is. So as I say, we don't always just give legal advice. Lots of times we simply give practical advice, or we give no advice at all and just hear them out.
Yeah, and that's the kind of support that we receive from all of our volunteer attorneys, the willingness to serve and be available for our clients, and we really appreciate it. So thank you, Bruce, for being on the call. And then the last piece, if you are interested in learning more about ELAP, we have our website as well as our hotline that's on the phone, on the PowerPoint slide here. On the left-hand side of this PowerPoint, there's an idea for you, kind of the work that we are doing local, statewide, and nationally, and the work that we're involved in. And then there's also Shane and my email address. And I want to kind of turn this over to you all if you have any questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody, thanks guys so much. You guys were fantastic. I think ELAP is an absolutely wonderful resource that our community has. And I am so glad we were able to record this, because I think this is going to be a really awesome resource for a lot of our chamber members. So if anybody has any questions, they can type them in the chat box, or they can just go ahead and ask them. But we do have a couple minutes. We can take some questions if anybody.
And as we're doing that, I'm going to share two pieces of information in the chat. So the question about foreclosure, not the question, but a question sometimes comes up about foreclosure and the support that you're able to receive. I'm typing in the chat here. It is from the Washington State Department of Financial Institutions, and they have information about the mediation program for foreclosure and a lot of other assistance. So I'm putting that in the chat, and I can also send it to you, Samantha, after the presentation, so you can also have that as well. The next thing I'm going to share, as I mentioned a little while ago, is our wills clinic. So our wills clinic is happening this Thursday evening for low-income clients that want to receive a will, power of attorney, and or an advanced medical directive. All of our services are completely free, and this is something that we're trying in the virtual space, and so as many people as possible would be great. They do have to call our hotline to get scheduled for the appointment, but day of, they'll join into a Zoom meeting and hop into a room where they'll be talking one-on-one with an attorney to make sure the estate planning documents are taken care of. So I shared that in the chat as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much again. You guys are great resources, and we're so grateful for the work that you do with our community. Let's see, I don't think there's any questions. I think you guys covered a lot of it. If you can send me these links, that would be great. I will have all of that posted on our website, as well as it will go out in our newsletter that we have going out on Friday also. But I think with that, I just want to say thank you to everybody for joining, and Chris and Shane, thank you guys so very much for everything that you do.
Thank you for having us. We appreciate it. We appreciate that time.
Thank you very much for having us.
Okay, everybody, have a good day.
Yeah, you too.
Take care.
Bye-bye.